Sagittarius, congratulations. It's over. You will never carry that pain again. The moment you finally exhale, there comes a moment, Sagittarius, when the soul whispers something so gentle yet so undeniable that it reaches you before your mind can fully understand it. A soft shift, a sudden lightness, a quiet knowing that something heavy, something you have carried for far too long, has finally fallen away. You may not have been able to name it yet. You may not have spoken it aloud, but somewhere inside, in the deepest part of your spirit, you have sensed it. A chapter that once defined you has ended. For good. For years, you've walked through life with the kind of strength that becomes invisible to others because you carry it so gracefully. You held your family together when life pulled in too many directions. You showed up at work even when your heart felt fractured. You supported aging parents, guided growing children, and still managed to be the emotional anchor for everyone who leaned on you. All of this while quietly hiding the exhaustion that lived beneath your ribcage. Your fire never went out, but it dimmed. Not from weakness, but from the weight of battles no one else could see. Battles you fought behind closed doors. Battles where you cried silently, wiped your tears, put your shoulders back, and kept moving because there were people who needed you. There were responsibilities that wouldn't wait. There were expectations you didn't dare disappoint. But Sagittarius, there is something the universe wants to say to you now, clearly and lovingly. Congratulations. It's over. You will never carry that burden again. Not because life suddenly became easy, not because someone stepped in to rescue you, but because you have changed in ways so profound, so internal, so sacred, that the version of you who once tolerated that pain no longer exists. A cycle of self-sacrifice has ended. A pattern of emotional over-responsibility has dissolved. A karmic lesson, long, repetitive, exhausting, has finally reached its last page. And though your mind may still be adjusting, though your body may still be remembering the habit of bracing for impact, your soul already knows. You have crossed a threshold you can never uncross. Take a breath with me, Sagittarius. A deep, slow, deliberate breath. Because the life waiting for you on the other side of this ending is lighter than anything you've carried before. This is the beginning of rest, renewal, and a return to yourself you may have thought was impossible. Welcome to the moment your healing begins. Chapter 1, the heavy chapter that is finally ending. There are certain seasons of life, Sagittarius, that do not simply exhaust you. They reshape you. Seasons where you wake up every morning already tired, not because you lack strength, but because you have spent years holding a world together with your bare hands. You know this season well. It has stretched across your timeline like a long shadow, touching everything you did and everything you were asked to be. For so long, you carried a weight no one else fully understood. You became the emergency contact for everyone's crisis, the emotional parent to people who weren't your children, the quiet protector of family members who depended on your stability, the one who absorbed tension, who held space, who swallowed disappointment so others wouldn't fall apart. Outwardly, you looked strong. Inwardly, you were holding yourself together with threads. And because you are Sagittarius, resilient, optimistic, endlessly hopeful, you kept believing that the burden would eventually lighten, that the season would shift, that the weight would ease if you just kept going a little longer. But instead of relief, the cycle deepened. You found yourself replaying the same emotional patterns, the same draining responsibilities, the same disappointments in different forms. It felt unfair. It felt endless. It felt like life kept asking more from you while giving very little back in return. This wasn't just stress. This wasn't just a rough patch. This was a karmic pattern, long, old, and deeply woven. A pattern built around the belief that you must always be the strong one, the responsible one, the savior, the fixer. A belief that your worth was measured by how much you could endure. A belief that your freedom needed to be postponed until everyone else was stable. But Sagittarius, freedom is not something you can postpone forever. It is your birthright. And the universe knew that if it didn't break this cycle, it would break you. So slowly, quietly, piece by piece, it began closing the chapter for you. Even when you weren't fully ready to let it go. You began feeling the cracks in your old identity. The way you used to show up suddenly felt too heavy. The roles you once played stopped fitting. The emotional load you carried for others started slipping from your hands. Not because you were failing, but because your soul was tired of the weight. The exhaustion you felt these past few years was not a sign of weakness. It was a sign of transition. A sign that the old version of you had reached her limit. A sign that the pattern itself was dissolving, even while your mind tried to hold it together out of habit. Because here is the truth. The cycle didn't end because the world around you changed. It ended because you changed. Something in you finally said, "No more." Even if you didn't speak it aloud, your spirit spoke it on your behalf. The Sagittarius woman you are today is not the woman who entered that cycle years ago. She is wiser. She is more discerning. She has learned the hard way that self-sacrifice is not the same as love. She has learned that exhaustion is not a badge of honor. She has learned that carrying others is noble, but carrying everyone is impossible. And the universe, seeing this profound internal shift, has responded. Certain relationships have grown distant not because you did something wrong, but because they were part of the cycle that needed to end. Certain responsibilities have slipped from your shoulders because life knows you are no longer meant to hold them. Certain disappointments resurface not to hurt you, but to push you to the final breaking point. The moment where you could no longer continue living as the older version of yourself. Sagittarius, that moment has already happened. You crossed the threshold. You left the old chapter behind without even realizing it. And now, as you stand at the edge of a new beginning, something remarkable becomes clear. You will never again return to that emotional prison. Not because you won't face challenges, but because the version of you that tolerated those patterns is gone. This chapter, the heavy one, the one defined by self-sacrifice, exhaustion, and silent suffering, has finally, definitively, and irreversibly ended. And the breath you take next is the first breath of the freedom you've waited years to feel. Chapter 2. The inner transformation that made the pain impossible to return. There comes a point in every soul's journey when growth happens so quietly, so gradually, that you do not realize how profoundly you have changed, until you try to step back into an old pattern and discover that it no longer fits. Sagittarius, this is exactly what has happened within you. You didn't wake up one morning suddenly transformed. You didn't experience a dramatic revelation or a lightning strike of clarity. Instead, your evolution unfolded softly, like dawn seeping into a dark room. Small shifts, quiet realizations, tiny refusals, subtle awakenings. And over time, these pieces gathered, forming a new version of you that is wiser, steadier, clearer, and far more sovereign than you have ever been. The pain that once consumed you cannot reach this version of you, because the woman who suffered through those old patterns simply no longer exists. You have rewritten the architecture of your spirit. You have outgrown the emotional habits that once kept you stuck. You have discarded the illusions that once shaped your decisions. You have shed the expectations that once dictated your worth. And whether you have fully acknowledged it or not, your inner world has shifted so deeply that suffering in the old way is no longer possible. For years, you approached life with a heart wide open and boundaries paper thin. You believed in people's potential instead of their patterns. You confused being needed with being valued. You thought that giving more would eventually bring balance, and that holding everything together meant you were strong. But something changed. Something essential. You reached a point where your spirit refused to be stretched any further. A subtle wisdom began forming inside you. A new understanding of where your energy ends and someone else's begins. You started recognizing the first signs of emotional imbalance instead of waiting until you were drowning in it. You began feeling the early tremor of too much, and honoring it instead of pushing through. You learned to sense the difference between being generous and being used, between being supportive and being drained, between being loyal and being self-erasing. This is the transformation no one else saw happening, but it is the transformation that saved you. You began to understand that your light does not need to burn itself out to prove its brilliance. Your strength does not require endless endurance. Your compassion does not require self-abandonment. Your independence does not mean carrying every burden alone. You learned that freedom is not the absence of responsibility. It is the presence of boundaries that protect your soul. And in this new understanding, something powerful happened. You stopped betraying yourself. You stopped silencing your own needs. You stopped rationalizing other people's behaviors. You stopped shrinking your truth to preserve someone else's comfort. You stopped giving your energy to those who only took and never replenished. You may not even remember the exact moment it happened. It might have been the day you finally said no without guilt, or the day you asked for help without apologizing, or the day you let someone else deal with the consequences of their own decisions. Or the day you allowed yourself to really rest without feeling irresponsible. Or perhaps it was simply the growing awareness that you deserved more. More respect, more reciprocity, more tenderness, more balance. That awareness alone was enough to break the pattern. And once a Sagittarius woman realizes her worth, the universe rearranges itself around that truth. You are not the same woman who entered that old cycle years ago. Your emotional reflexes have changed. Your standards have changed. Your expectations have changed. Your relationship with yourself has changed. What once triggered you now bores you. What once drained you now repels you. What once trapped you now feels too small to contain you. The transformation is complete, Sagittarius, not because you forced it, but because you outgrew everything that was incompatible with your truth. You have stepped into a new emotional frequency, one that no longer tolerates suffering disguised as responsibility, one that no longer romanticizes struggle, one that no longer confuses chaos with passion or self-sacrifice with love. And now, even if the old situations tried to return, even if the same type of person reappeared, even if you were offered the same role you once accepted, you simply could not go back. Spiritually, emotionally, energetically, it would be impossible. Like trying to squeeze a wise soul into a past version of a life that can no longer contain her. This is why the cycle is over. This is why the pain cannot touch you. This is why the universe says, you will never go through that again. Because you are no longer someone who fits inside that suffering. You have expanded beyond it. And the expansion has only just begun. Chapter 3. The signs that prove you will never repeat that old pattern again. There is a moment in every transformation when the shift inside you becomes visible outside of you. Not in a dramatic way, not through sudden fireworks or grand declarations, but through quiet, unmistakable signs, subtle changes in your reactions, your boundaries, your emotional landscape. These signs are not random. They are evidence. They are the universe's way of saying, look closely. You are no longer who you used to be. And Sagittarius, if you've been paying attention, you've already begun to notice these signs. The first sign appears in your body before it appears in your mind. You find yourself feeling tired in places where you once felt obligated. Someone calls with the same crisis they've had for years, and instead of rushing to fix everything, your spirit steps back. Not out of coldness, but out of clarity. You suddenly see that their crisis is not your responsibility to carry. The reflex to rescue, the reflex that defines so many years of your life, simply isn't there anymore. A second sign emerges in your emotional responses. What once triggered deep anxiety or guilt now barely registers. The dramatic behavior, the manipulation, the people-pleasing demands that used to pull you into a spiral, now feel strangely distant, almost irrelevant. It's not numbness. It's growth. It's the sensation of standing in a room where the volume has finally been turned down after years of unbearable noise. Another sign shows up in your relationships. You begin to recognize who has been taking more than they've given. Something in you shifts when you interact with them. You can sense the imbalance with a clarity you never had before. You're no longer flattered by minimal effort. You're no longer moved by empty gestures. You're no longer softened by excuses you once accepted. Without fanfare, you find yourself stepping back, creating space, reclaiming energy. And Sagittarius, this is one of the most powerful indicators of all. You no longer chase clarity, you wait for it. You no longer demand answers, you observe. You no longer run after people. You remain still and let their intentions reveal themselves. This quiet confidence is the mark of a soul who has finally learned her worth. You may have also noticed that your boundaries have changed. Not because you forced them, but because they grew naturally out of your new sense of self. You say no without trembling. You say I can't today without guilt. You say that doesn't work for me, with a calm that surprises even you. These are not just sentences. They are sacred declarations of self-respect. They are proof that your transformation is real. But perhaps the most profound sign is this. You no longer feel responsible for other people's emotions. You still care deeply. You still love wholeheartedly. You still support generously. But you no longer feel obligated to carry the emotional consequences of everyone else's choices. This is the moment your spirit steps into sovereignty. This is the moment you stop living as someone's emotional anchor and start living as your own. There are external signs too. Gentle synchronicities that confirm the shift. People who once drained you drift away. Opportunities aligned with your truth begin to appear. Conversations feel lighter. Connections feel more mutual. You find yourself attracting people who want to walk beside you, not behind you, and definitely not on your back. Even the world around you responds differently. You feel more at peace in your solitude. You waste less time explaining yourself. You no longer fear losing people who were never truly present. You no longer cling to situations that don't honor your soul. Sagittarius, these are not coincidences. These are consequences of your expansion. When your inner world changes, your outer world must reorganize itself to match your frequency. And here is the most beautiful thing. People who once triggered your deepest wounds now reveal your deepest healing. Their behavior hasn't changed, but your relationship to it has. What once shattered you now barely scratches the surface. What once controlled you now feels small and powerless. What once trapped you now feels too fragile to hold the woman you've become. This is how you know the cycle is over. This is how you know you will never go through the same pain again. Not because life will be free of challenges, but because you will never again hand your power to a situation that asks you to shrink, to suffer, to sacrifice yourself. You are no longer at the mercy of old wounds. You are no longer shaped by old stories. You are no longer defined by the version of you who carried everything alone. You have grown past the point where pain was your teacher. Now peace becomes your guide. And as this chapter of your life closes, the universe prepares to open a door you have been waiting to walk through for years. A door Jupiter has been holding for you with patience and love. The next chapter isn't about surviving. It's about expanding. It's about freedom. It's about receiving with the same generosity you've always given. And Sagittarius, that is exactly what waits for you now. Chapter 4, the new life Jupiter opens for you now. There is a moment, Sagittarius, when the air around you begins to feel different. Softer, lighter, wider. As if the universe has quietly expanded the space you stand in. And perhaps you've already sensed it in small ways. A breath that feels easier than usual. A morning that doesn't carry the same dread. A silence that feels comforting instead of lonely. These are not coincidences. These are the first notes of the new chapter Jupiter is opening for you. Because when a Sagittarius woman completes a karmic cycle, a cycle built on self-sacrifice, emotional strain, and silent endurance, the universe does not simply give her relief. It gives her expansion. It gives her space to grow into the version of herself she was always meant to become. A version that is not shaped by burden but by truth. Not shaped by obligation but by desire. Not shaped by survival but by freedom. This new phase of your life begins with one profound realization. You finally belong to yourself again. For years, your energy was scattered across responsibilities. Your time was divided. Your emotional bandwidth was stretched thin. Even your sense of identity became entangled with what others needed from you. But as the old pattern collapsed, something sacred happened. Your spirit began returning home. Back to you. Back to your heart. Back to your freedom. And with that return comes a powerful shift. You no longer live reactively. You no longer live waiting for the next crisis. You no longer live shrinking so others feel comfortable. You no longer live proving your strength to anyone. Instead, your life becomes guided by a quieter, truer compass, the compass of self-respect. As Jupiter opens this new path, you may notice that your choices become cleaner, clearer, more aligned. You stop settling for situations that dim your fire. You stop entertaining people who only love you when you're useful to them. You stop accepting work, relationships, or obligations that drain your spirit. You no longer negotiate your worth. You no longer explain your boundaries. You no longer apologize for being someone who needs space, rest, and truth. And here is where the magic begins. The universe fills the space you reclaim. The people entering your life now feel different, softer, safer, more sincere. They don't take from you, they meet you. They don't drain you, they uplift you. They don't fear your strength, they admire it. These are connections built on reciprocity, not repair. On presence, not performance. On truth, not tension. Your opportunities begin to shift too. You may find yourself drawn to work that engages your mind and inspires your spirit. You may notice new pathways opening that honor your freedom, your creativity, your wisdom. The parts of you that have been pushed into the background for far too long. You are entering a season of alignment, where what is meant for you isn't something you have to chase. It's something that recognizes your energy and moves toward you naturally. And perhaps the most healing transformation of all, you begin to feel safe with yourself. Safe to rest. Safe to say no. Safe to not be strong every moment of the day. Safe to ask for help. Safe to be vulnerable without feeling exposed. Safe to be human without fear of judgment or disappointment. This is the deepest form of freedom, the freedom to exist without performing, the freedom to take up space without guilt, the freedom to choose yourself without apology. Sagittarius, you are stepping into a life built on inner spaciousness. A life where you no longer shrink to fit the expectations of others. A life where forgiveness includes forgiving yourself for the years you tried to be everything for everyone. A life where peace is not a fleeting moment, but your new baseline. This is the life Jupiter brings. A life shaped by authenticity, expansion, meaning, and spiritual maturity. You are no longer defined by the heaviness of your past. You are defined by the truth of your evolution. And as you walk into this new phase, you carry something priceless. Not the weight of what broke you, but the wisdom of what rebuilt you. This is your open sky. This is your sacred beginning. This is your return to the woman you were always meant to become. Conclusion: you are finally free. There is a certain kind of stillness that only comes after a long battle. Not the loud, triumphant kind, but the quiet, sacred kind. The kind that settles into your chest when you realize that the storm has not only passed, it has transformed you. And as you stand here now, Sagittarius, at the edge of everything you have survived, there is a truth rising gently within you. You are finally free. Not free because life suddenly became easy. Not free because the world rearranged itself overnight. But free because you have returned to yourself. For years you moved through life carrying more than anyone knew, balancing the needs of a family, the expectations of others, the invisible weight of responsibility that felt too heavy yet never stopped coming. You endured seasons that should have broken you, and yet, somehow, your spirit refused to disappear. Even when dimmed, your fire never died. And that alone was enough to lead you here. As you look back, you may feel the echoes of exhaustion, the memories of holding tears in rooms where you were required to be strong, the moments when you fought battles no one ever acknowledged. But if you look even closer, you'll see something else, something far more powerful. You didn't just survive that chapter. You transcended it. You outgrew versions of yourself that once believed suffering was the price of belonging. You peeled away the layers of self-sacrifice that once convinced you that love required breaking yourself into pieces. You stopped confusing endurance with worth, strength with silence, or love with depletion. And with each inner shift, with each quiet realization, with each moment when you finally chose yourself, the old chapter dissolved thread by thread. The cycle is over not because the world promised you peace, but because you no longer resonate with the frequency of your former suffering. The woman who tolerated those patterns, who carried everything alone, who accepted too little and gave too much, she no longer exists. You have grown past her. You have stepped into a broader sky. And now, as Jupiter opens this new pathway before you, something beautiful happens. Your past becomes a teacher, not a prison. You understand now why certain people fell away, why certain situations became unbearable, why your spirit kept whispering that you deserved more. You understand why the universe had to shake you loose from anything that diminished you. You understand why your heart needed to break to reveal the self-love that had been waiting beneath the rubble. And in this understanding you rise, not with force but with grace. Not with urgency but with certainty. Not with anger but with clarity. This is your coronation, Sagittarius. Not the kind with applause or ceremony, but the kind where your soul quietly sits back into its rightful throne. Where you reclaim the freedom you postponed. Where you reclaim the energy you scattered. Where you reclaim the voice you silenced. Where you reclaim the self you abandoned while trying to be everything for everyone. And as the new chapter begins, here is the truth you must carry forward. You will never go through that pain again. Not because life is perfect, but because you are finally living from a place where pain cannot deceive you into staying. You see more clearly. You choose more wisely. You protect yourself more gently. You honor yourself more consistently. This is the peace you have earned through every tear, every lesson, every night you held your heart together until morning. This peace is not fragile. It is woven into your bones now. It is yours to keep. So breathe, Sagittarius. Let your shoulders soften. Let your heart expand. Let your spirit lift itself into the open sky that has always belonged to you. You have ended a chapter that once felt endless. You have freed yourself from a story that once defined you. You have returned fully, beautifully, unapologetically to the truth of who you are. And from this moment forward, your life will reflect that truth. Welcome to your new beginning, Sagittarius. May it be lighter than anything you've carried before.